There is one secret to creating amazing textures for your characters. Values. If you build proper values for your characters, converting those values to a usable color map is very easy with Substance 3D Painter. In this video, I'll show you how to create a black and white value map for your characters and then transform that with colors using Substance 3D Painter gradients and stylization filters. And of course, we will talk about hand-painted stuff and how we can build up the values to get to this final result. Let's go. Everything, as we know, starts with the bakes. If we have good bakes, then the texturing process is going to be super simple. The great thing is that we now have a very cool tool here inside of Substance 3D Painter, which is the Auto Cage feature. I'm going to load in my high poly right here, and what I did with this particular character is that I took every single part of it, the teeth, the harpoons, the main body, and divided it into its own underscore low poly and underscore high poly. This is very important because with this, we're going to be able to tell Substance that we only want certain areas to bake into each other. I'm going to go here into my high poly. I'm going to, of course, bake at 4K. I want to have the maximum resolution for this particular character. And we're going to change the match to by mesh name. You need to go check here by the matching by name. Make sure that every single object has its corresponding element. We're going to set the anti-aliasing to 16x, and there's a new feature, as I've mentioned, the auto cage feature, which is on by default, but you can also change this to automatic experimental, and as you can see, it's going to try to find the specific cage for each of the elements in your object. So what this will do is it should give us very tight bakes without any contamination between the islands, because of course we have the match by mesh name, and we should get a very nice result. We're going to, of course, have our normal map. We're going to have our ambient occlusion, curvature map, and the thickness, which I'm going to be showing you some cool tricks at the end. If we go into our main viewport, we're going to be able to see the bakes. And as you can see, they look quite nice. Keep in mind that this is a very low poly mesh. I believe this is only at 7K triangles for the whole thing. So I'm keeping it quite low poly, which is usually what we do for some game engine pipelines. You might see a little bit of contamination going on here with ambient occlusion, especially on the borders where two meshes intersect. That's very common, and you can fix it by going to the croissant, going to the ambient occlusion map, and just change the self-occlusion to only same mesh name. However, in this particular case, I don't think we are going to be struggling too much with that thing. There we go, super clean bakes, super fast, and now we're ready for building up our values. For the hand-painted process, one of the things that's very important in most of the pipelines, not all of them, is that we're going to be baking all of the information, the normal map information, all of the crevices, all of the information of our geometry into a single color map. So if I press letter C right now, I'm going to be jumping to the different channels, and I'm going to jump all the way to the base color channel right here. I'm going to add a fill layer. I'm going to call this main value. And this is going to be the value that I'm going to be starting with. I usually like to start with darker values, such as this mid, darker tone gray. And we're going to be using this to build up all of our volumes and make sure that our character looks 3D in a simple flat map. The first generator that I'm going to add is I'm going to add a black mask right here, and on the base color, I'm just going to go for an ambient occlusion map. What this will do is it will connect the ambient occlusion map that we baked into this layer. So now if I want to do or change anything on this base color, the only thing I need to do is right click, add the levels right here, and we can play with levels to change how the ambient occlusion looks. So I'm going to push it a little bit more just to get, a little bit more punch right here. And the cool thing is we can set this layer to something like multiply. When you set a layer to multiply, all of the white colors of the lighter values get pretty much erased, and we're only gathering or multiplying the darker values against the background, which in this case is our main value right here. Now, a very important thing about values is that you never want to push them to the extremes. I personally really like the impressionism sort of like style that we have right here on some of these examples, because if you take a look at that, if you study the colors, you're going to see that you don't need super dark colors or super bright colors to express shadows and lights. And a lot of new projects nowadays are using this sort of like more pastel looking color palette to really imply all of the value differences without really crunching all of our elements. So what I'm going to do here is exactly that. I'm just going to bring the overlay here, or the opacity, a little bit lower so that we don't have pure blacks on our element. The next layer that I'm going to add is a very nice layer that I love using, which is the light generator. I'm going to add a fill layer here, black layer, add a black mask, right click, add a generator, and we're going to use the light generator. I've talked about this generator before. As you know, Substance 3D Painter has so many generators, but this one's pretty cool because we can use these knobs right here to push the direction of the light. And in this case, since it's the shadow, I'm going to push the knobs down here, and we can play with the highlight glossiness as well as the highlight level to really push the shadow and start giving us that volume that we perceive on the element. This one, I'm also going to set to multiply, and I'm also going to play a little bit with the multiplier here so that it's not super dark. Again, we don't want to go to the extremes, because once you get to those extremes, there's no way to go even further if you want to push certain things more. So look at the big difference, just 2 layers and we already have a lot of volume being described here on our character, but we definitely want to highlight some other elements a bit more. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to call this main light or light, and I'm going to right click, add a black mask, right click, add another generator, and we're going to again add our light generator. And with this one, I'm going to make sure that this is pointing up. I'm going to play a little bit with the highlight glossiness, just making sure that this blends a little bit better. Make sure that you don't overexpose things. You can see that when we overexpose, especially this upper area, we lose all of the beautiful detail that we had from the high poly. So we need to find a specific point where we see a little bit of this volume, but it's not overwhelming my element. I'm actually going to use a little bit of light attenuation here so that we don't get light all the way down here onto the belly of the shark. And you can see how this one can really make everything pop quite nicely. I'm going to layer one more, and this is one of the things that I wanted to show you on this tutorial, the fact that you can combine as many of these generators as you want. Actually, let me just duplicate this thing right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the light generator. Here's a little trick that I like to do. I change the color to a very bright color to really see where this thing is affecting the shark, and if I go to the light generator, I can play, for instance, a little bit with the highlight glossiness, so that now this second layer of white is only hitting the very highest points of my element. Push it a little bit more. It's going to give me a little bit more of a shiny look to the whole thing. And then, of course, we go back to the color and we get it back to white. And look at that difference right there. So from this to this, we can now see the different layers of values. And that's one very important secret about color theory. Pick any of your favorite classical artworks. For me, Rembrandt, an amazing artist. And if you pick any of those artworks, bring it into Photoshop and then desaturate the whole thing, you're still going to be able to see what's going on. So even though colors are super important to make images and all of our works pop, they're not the most important thing. The most important thing, the thing that our eyes perceive and the things that we need to really understand an image are the values. Similar to how when we're talking about anatomy, we talk about form and proportions. Well, in terms of color and in terms of texturing, one of the things that you always need to look for are values, making sure that the values properly describe the surfaces and the volumes, of course, of your piece. So I really like how this one's looking. I'm definitely going to lower this just a tiny bit. Usually the highlights I like to add at the very end of my process so that I can have full control over them. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is something called local color values. So every single object will have a specific sort of tone to it, and you can see it on myself right now. My face is a lot lighter than my shirt. Even though they're experimenting the same light sources here in the studio, they have a different local color value, and therefore the way we perceive them are going to be slightly different. So I'm going to add, for instance, a darker tone right here, all desaturated, add a black mask. I'm going to go to number 4, which is my fill object element. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to fill in my harpoon, my ropes, which is very easy if your meshes are separate. This is another big advantage of what we did on the high poly, low poly sort of breakdown. And now the only thing I need to do is change this to something like a multiply. And this will inherit some of the light information from the previous layers. Of course, this is way too dark, but if we set this to something like, I don't know, 50% or something like that, they're going to have a slightly different color than the rest of the shark. And this is important so that we can have a little bit of variation and people know where to look at when they're appreciating our work. We can do the exact same thing with our teeth. So I'm going to go add black mask right here, select number 4, select all of these things, and then press X and click on the body so that the body is not selected. This one, though, I'm going to change. Instead of using multiply, which is not really going to do anything, I'm going to change this to linear dodge. Linear dodge is very similar to multiply, but it pushes values up. So if you have lighter colors, it's going to sort of exponentially make them brighter. And of course, we're also going to sort of bring this down a little bit so that we can still see some of the lower tones or other tones that we had before. This, again, is usually referred to as local color values, and it's how we can change the whole thing to generate a little bit more detail. I'm going to add 2 more layers here, 2 more layers to really bring this into life. And the first one is going to be a generator layer. It's going to be a dark layer, add a black mask, and this is going to be, of course, our very common and very familiar dirt layer. There we go. Look at that. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the grunge amount. I really don't want any grunge, but I am going to push the dirt a little bit more. I'm going to make this a little bit more extreme, and you're going to see why in just a second. Because now, one of the things that I can do is I can right-click, add a filter, and I really like using the blur slope filter because it really breaks things down and gives this sort of artsy feel to the whole thing. We're going to talk about filters a little bit more at the end of the video. I'm going to change the intensity divider to something like 10 so that the splotches or the breakpoints are not as big. And then, of course, we can set this to something like a multiply again and just lower the opacity a bit. Because, yes, I want to introduce a little bit of variation on, for instance, the teeth and some of the gills and things like that, but not too much. You can at any point go back here to the color, for instance, and if the value is a little bit too low, we can also sort of increase it a little bit so it's not overwhelming. Finally, I'm going to add one more layer, and this is going to be a black mask, generator as well, and we're going to go with a metal edgeware. Metal edgewares are also very nice because they're going to help me with the highlight of the borders. I'm going to increase the highlight level of these things. Same stuff, I don't want grunge, so I just want to keep this very, very simple on the borders. And then what I'm going to do with this one is I'm actually going to use another generator, and this is going to be a position generator. So the position generator, remember, you can always press Alt and click on the mask to see what the mask is doing. The position generator is a very good generator to have, well, a gradient. And in this case, I just want that sort of like metal edgeware on the top part of my shark. So if I go here, I can set this to multiply, and as you can see, we're going to have more of this metal edgeware on the top parts of the shark and less of the metal edgeware on the bottom parts. Now, of course, this is a little bit too much, so I'm going to go here to my element. I am going to set it to linear dodge so we get more color out of it, and then I'm going to bring it down. I usually like to keep this at something like 20%, 25%. So it's mainly just a guide and an indication to break up the silhouette a bit more with my whole thing here. So there we go. With this, we've successfully completed the basic construction of our values. And now, even though we're in the base color, completely flat element, we can still see the volume, and it looks like a three-dimensional shape. So we're not going to be dependent on any lights or any normal map information to describe the form, and we can see this little guy swimming around and attacking us in the game. The next step, oh, you're going to like it. I'm going to grab all of the elements right here, Control G to create a new group, and I'm going to call this group my values. At any point, I can add more generators, I can paint some layers in, like if I want to bring some values up or bring some values down, it's very easy to just add more layers inside of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this thing, and I'm going to create an anchor point. Anchor points can also be created to groups, and this is very, very important because we can transfer information from one part of our project to another. So now that we have an anchor point that's called values, we can use that information to start coloring our shark. The way we're going to do this is by adding a new fill layer, and instead of filling this layer with a uniform color, I'm going to click on base color, I'm going to go to anchor points, and I'm going to sample the values anchor point that I have right here. To make this clear, what I'm doing is I'm taking all of the layers that I have on the values folder, creating an anchor point that adds all of those layers, and now I'm pretty much merging them procedurally, because at any point I can go back and change the values here into this new main color layer. And this is where the magic happens. I'm going to right click on this thing, and I'm going to add a filter. And the filter that I'm going to be adding is only going to be affecting the color, and it's going to be the gradient filter. So the way the gradient filter works is it's going to take a specific amount of colors. Right now it's set to 3, but I'm actually going to set this to 4. It's going to take a specific amount of colors, and then it's going to remap the values that we have right now to the new colors that I'm selecting. So for instance, if I grab the black colors and I set this to red, you can see that all of the dark tones or all of the dark colors are now going to be set to red. If I do the exact same thing with the white colors, but let's say to green, we're going to see this gradient where we're going from, again, this nice red to this nice green right here. Now, color theory is a whole nother topic. We can maybe talk about that in another time. But right now, I'm going to select a very simple palette that follows this sort of like greenish, bluish hues for the zombie shark. I'm going to go for the darkest tone, and I'm going to go to this green, bluish hues. I'm going to go dark and quite saturated, something like that. The next color is also going to be on this sort of like green, a little bit more desaturated, something like that. There you go. I really like that tone right there. And then the next one, of course, it's going to be close to this one, but we should be pushing a little bit higher. And normally what I recommend is shift your hue a little bit. In this case, I'm going to go a little bit more towards the blue colors so that we have a little bit more of a juicy image, right? Like not everything is super monotone. And then the last one, I'm also going to sample this color. I'm going to push it up. I might go even a little bit closer to the teal colors or the blue colors. There you go. And again, don't go to the borders. Don't go to limits. We're going to push that later. Once we have that, we can use these sliders right here to really push some of the dark shadows or some of the mid values right here to showcase or get a little bit more of a grungy, intense gradient. So this is how you're going to be controlling this initial block out of the color. For instance, I'm going to go to this green right here, and I actually kind of want to go to a different tone. So I'm going to go for more of a blue hue instead. There we go. Maybe just a little bit less dark, so something like that. Remember, this is grabbing the information that we had from our values and converting that into a color gradient. It kind of looks like a phantom shark. I like it. Be very careful not to go over the position of the colors. If this happens, what's going to happen is you're going to have some weird effects or weird artifacts occurring on some of the elements because you're pushing some of these values lower than the original one should be. So it should look a little bit more like a stair step effect. If some of the values are a little bit too bright, we can always sort of like tone them down. And anytime later on, we can of course modify those colors as well. We can repeat this process now with another element, for instance, the teeth. So I'm going to grab a new fill layer right here, go to the base color, anchor points, grab my values, right click, I'm going to add a black mask right here. And what I want to do is, of course, select only the teeth, like that. So now if we go to this one, right click, add another filter, turn everything off, and select our gradient, we're going to be able to do the exact same thing. So for instance, in this one, we're going to go for like a darkish brown for the root of the teeth. And then we're going to go like this beige color, and then the highlights. White is fine, but again, I don't like using those extremes, so I'm going to push a little bit more towards the yellows and keep it something like there. And play with these ranges, crunch the values a little bit so that we can see a little bit more of that effect showing through. You can also use this to give a little bit of a better impression in the local color values that we were talking about, right? So, as you can see, by adding a couple of extra gradient layers, we can completely colorize our element and have a base layer to work with. Now let's add a little bit more color. I'm going to add a couple of layers to sort of like bring this thing more to life, even though it's an undead shark. First layer, a red layer, you know, some blood, a little bit of life, black mask, generator, dirt generator. So I kind of like this color. It's looking quite nice, but I'm going to do a couple of changes here. Instead of using the multiply or the overlay that are very intense, and while not keeping the normal map, I want to set this to color. If you set this to a color blending mode, what's going to happen is it's going to try to keep most of your values in check. So it's not going to be super aggressive in this particular case. So I'm going to push this down, of course. I'm going to keep this at like a 32%. And as you can see, this is already incorporating a little bit of life to the whole thing. Another layer that I love using is a little bit of thickness layer. So if we go here to our layer, I'm going to grab a color similar to what we already have. So this is like phantomish, grayish or greenish color. I'm going to try to keep it really saturated for just 1 second. I'm going to add a black mask. I'm going to add a fill layer. In this fill layer, I'm going to look not for the ambient occlusion, but for the thickness map. Because the thickness, as we know, will tell us which parts of the element are thicker and which parts are thinner. What I want to do here, of course, is I'm going to add a levels, and I'm going to flip this so that we're going for the thin areas right there. And then if we set this to linear dodge, you're going to see how this elements start to glow very nicely. The cool thing, again, is we can play with some of the elements right here to make sure that this is only hitting some specific parts of my character. I'm actually going to try something else, like a color again. Yeah, there you go. Color is actually giving us a nice vibe there because it's filling in, or it's adding a little bit of color to some areas. I'm going to have it below the blood, though. And that should add just a little bit of extra life to the whole thing. If you don't want something, at any point, we can just go to something like a paint layer. Just paint out some of the sections. So for instance, here on the mouth, I'm definitely going to be using another type of like effect. But look at how cool our whole shark is looking now without the need to be doing anything hand painted so far. This is all just the construction of the values and the construction of our initial color blocking. Now, at this point, we can use some new stuff. I'm going to Control G all of our color. Keep in mind that all of this is procedural, so if at any point your art director or your client tells you, hey, we don't want the shark to be blue and gray, we want this to be, you know, a little bit different, a slightly different color, just come back here, go to the colors, and switch things around, and everything's going to update in real time without you having to go and paint. Hopefully, you guys can see how powerful that tool is. Now, one thing that we're definitely missing is, you know, a little bit more variation, especially on the top part of the shark. Usually, sharks are a little bit darker in terms of the skin on the top part, and lighter on the bottom. Right now, due to the way we're building the light, it's looking a little bit different. So I'm just gonna add a new layer right here. I'm gonna add a black mask. And the way I like to approach this type of like blockings is just worrying about the main things first, and then worrying about the color. So for instance, here, using the black mask, and of course using symmetry here inside the Substance 3D Painter, we're gonna just move this thing a little bit towards the center. There we go. And we can paint all of this like upper layer of the shark. Once I have that, it's a lot easier to just go back here, select a nice green color that I want to use. Again, it's probably going to be this dark green color, and look for a specific blending mode that really helps me. In this case, again, I can try something like color. That's definitely going to be too much. I can try value. Ooh, that looks interesting. But let's go for something simple like an overlay, and then just play a little bit with the opacity. That way, we still keep most of the values that we have, right? Like this brighter elements, while getting or winning a little bit more variation on the top. In the animal kingdom, we have what I call the giraffe principle, which means that if you want to add any type of pattern, it usually fades. It never just like abruptly stops. There's always a little bit of a fade. Take a look at the spots on the giraffe, and you're going to see that on the center mass of the giraffe, there's going to be big spots, and then as you go towards the legs, the spots become smaller and smaller until they pretty much fade into a lighter color. You're going to see this everywhere in the animal kingdom. So what I can do here is do something similar with a dots pattern. So I can start adding a little bit of dots here, and then just losing some of those elements. We can start with bigger dots, closer to the line where it starts generating this sort of like blend. I'm going to go even bigger. I'm just going to start up here so we get some big spots every now and then. And then as you can see, the little spots that we have are going to help me blend that whole thing and generate a very interesting texture. Then, of course, we can keep on playing with a little bit of the intensity here. I do feel like my colors are getting a little bit dark, so I'm going to go back to the initial gradients right here, and this mid-tone, I'm just going to push it up a little bit so that we can see a little bit more of our shark. And this is again the beauty of the gradients and this value process, that at any point we can just go in here and modify some of these elements so that we can find something that looks a little bit nicer. I'm gonna add one more layer right here at the very top, black mask, and of course gonna select the eyes. And I think I want to go for some like ghostly look, so maybe something like this highlight blue right there, and of course set to linear dodge so that we can get a little bit of information, right? Some glow effect right there. Now, the final little thing that I'm going to show you right here are the new stylization filters that we have. And even though they don't make the whole thing for you, like they're not going to solve all of your issues, they're not like a magic thing that we just wave around and they're just magically going to give us perfect hand-painted stuff, they do give us a lot of interesting texture and interesting patterns that we can use as a sort of inspiration and as a base to keep on pushing from there. Right-click on the folder right here, add a new filter, make sure that this is only affecting the color information, and grab this new stylization filter. What the stylization filter does is it takes the information, in this case from all of the group, and it converts it. It literally replaces what we have and gives it a little bit of this like artistic look. It looks a little bit blurred right now, but there are some things that we can control to get a better result. The first thing is the preset. If we change some of the presets, for instance, if we go to this hand-painted style, you're going to see that the way the brush strokes look are going to be slightly different. I really like this one right here because it definitely tries to follow like the shape or the direction of some of the brush strokes that we have. Keep in mind that right now, this stylization filter is set to replace, meaning that it's literally replacing everything inside of the folder and giving us this result. You can blend this. If you want to have a little bit of your original color, you can use this to blend things a little bit. Or you could even change this to something like a linear dodge or something like an overlay. Of course, this is going to be way too dark, but it's a good way to sort of like generate a different result. If we go back here to the elements, we can reduce the stylization. What's going to happen is we're going to recover or get a little bit more of our original colors and gradients and get rid of this sort of like stylization effect. In the brush stroke sections, I really like to increase, for instance, the brush strokes amount, and you can also bring the strokes scale down so that the strokes are a little bit smaller. There's even interesting ones like this colorful strokes that will give us a lot of variation on the colors as well. Look at that. I know that this is way too extreme, right? But again, if we start blending this with something like, I don't know, like a linear dodge and then play with the opacity of this thing, we might be able to incorporate an interesting set of tones here and there that we could use as an inspiration to add to our final hand-painted approach. So I finally settled with this one right here, and I'm using roughly half of the stylization filter. I got rid of the backlighting for this one, increased the strokes amount and decreased the scale, and as you can see, we get a nice result. Now, I know what you guys are gonna say. You're gonna say, but Dave, this is not hand-painted. You've just been using filters and generators and all of these layers to create a picture that looks hand-painted, but it's not exactly hand-painted, and you are totally right. Keep in mind that with any of these workflows, there's multiple ways to get to a desired result. In this particular case, I'm using all of these generators and this buildup to get me a base to then go in and actually do the hand painting process. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you the whole process, but I want to show you the tools that I normally use when building my hand painted layers. First, I like to use my basic hard brush, and I like to go to my alphas and change the alpha to a square alpha. This is so that I get a little bit more of a texture and something that looks, a little bit more organic or interesting. I do remove the size pen pressure right here, and I do turn on my pen pressure on the stroke opacity. Bring the spacing as low as you can, and then bring the stroke opacity relatively low, because I do feel like the opacity here inside of Substance 3D Painter can be a little bit heavy sometimes. Once you have this, it's very easy. Just hit P on a color, sample the color that you have right there, and you can start painting and adding a little bit of value. What we're going to be doing, of course, is we're going to be adding this value on specific areas of our element to build up the volumes that we want. If you want to bring this higher up, then the only thing we need to do is grab a little bit of a lighter color and then start building these elements right here. Of course, once we have this, we hit the P again, start grabbing some of the mid values, and we start blending. This is the time-consuming part. This is, in my opinion, the most fun part of the whole process, which is to use what we've already created with the base of our element, and using the tools that we have here within Substance 3D Painter, just build up all of the remaining layers. This right here is the result of 1 hour of painting. I went over and I started adding all of the values on the top areas of my element, all of the light colors, added more saturation on the teeth, and you can see a lot of the initial setup or a lot of the initial construction is still here. After roughly another hour of polishing, this is what I have right now, and I usually make folders with these stages so that I can go and tweak certain values depending on if I want to modify any of the elements. You can keep pushing this. You can keep adding more stuff, adding more layers, adding more generators, and building up the desired result for whatever art direction you're following. I'm adding 3 final layers right here. The first one is a very basic light layer with a little bit of a brownish, sort of like warm color here on the belly, because I thought that the colors were looking a little bit too uniform, and this sort of like breaks that down. It also gives me a little bit of a bounce light coming from the bottom, which I think works quite nicely with this character. This position layer is really interesting because what I'm doing with this position layer, if you take a look at the mask, is I'm actually desaturating some parts of the element. So the further down we go, the more desaturated we get, and this helps me bring the attention to the upper parts of my character. I add this little highlight right here with another light generator just to punch the last little bits of highlights on my element. And finally, a final noise texture here on the top to break up some of the uniformity on the patterns and give me a nicer blend along the whole surface. So as you guys can see, we went from the bakes to the basic construction of our values to the main gradient colors, to the painting stage, and then of course details and presentation. This is the workflow that we can use, and thanks to the tools within Substance 3D Painter, we can get there very quickly. I hope you liked this video, my friends, and I hope you learned a lot. And if you want to learn more about Substance 3D Painter, make sure to check more tutorials like this one here in Substance 3D channel. I'll see you back on the next one.